Cornell in 2006 with a dissertation titled The Technological Imaginary of Imperial Japan, 1931 to 1945. During his PhD research, he spent a year at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and before taking his current post at Arizona State, where he earned tenure in 2014, he held postdocs and teaching positions at Harvard, MIT, Ohio University, and UCLA. Aaron's first book, Constructing East Asia, Technology, Ideology, and Empire in Japan's Wartime Era, came out with Stanford in hardback in 2013, and I'm very jealous, paperback in 2015. A Chinese edition has just been published, and is almost published, and Japanese edition is underway. Aaron's second project is called Damming Asia, the Cold War and Japanese Post-Colonial Overseas Development. This project has won research fellowships from the NEH, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and the Chujeonga Institute for Korean Studies at Seoul National University. Thank you. The project has also launched a collaboration with fellow historians Hiromi Mizuno and John DeMoya, with whom Aaron co-edited a 2018 anthology published by Bloomsbury and titled Engineering Asia, Technology, Colonial Development, and the Cold War Order. We're really pleased to welcome you to ECI and hear more about this project.
Good, thank you very much. Since I'm kind of talking this way, I'll use the mic, but I'll try to speak loudly, okay? So I'm going to begin my talk with a story. Parts of it very well known, parts of it not so well known. In the late 1950s, around Minamata Bay in Kyushu, where the industrial conglomerate Chisso was based, cases of uncontrollable shaking, brain atrophy, and madness appeared among the fishing communities. This is the beginning of the Minamata disaster, whereby Chisso's dumping of methyl mercury into the bay entered into the local ecosystems and food chain to cause Minamata disease. This environmental disaster galvanized a movement among the victims for recognition and compensation during the 1960s and 70s, and raised serious questions about Japan's path of industrialization, which was being achieved through sacrificing its citizens' lives, health, and communities. Images of their trembling bodies in pain were powerful indictments not only of Chisso, but also of industrial modernity itself, and Japan's rush to comprehensively engineer and simplify its environments for high-speed economic growth. Despite the fact that Minamata activists have already pointed out to the colonial aspects of Minamata disease and environmental destruction in Japan, Minamata's narrative has largely remained a national story. But further research has shown that this domestic story is more complex and has transnational roots dating from the colonial era. 1924, the story starts. A former Home Ministry engineer named Kubota Yutaka traveled to northern Korea to conduct a hydropower study. Going against a conventional wisdom that Korea was unsuitable for dam development, he discovered a landscape laid bare by slash-and-burn itinerant farmers near the Pujan River, which was a Yalu River tributary. And so just to point to where it is, this is the Pujan River Dam, and then these are just all the different points later on, but I just want to give you an idea of geography here. But for Kubota, this landscape wasn't barren, right? It represented a huge reservoir of energy to power heavy industrialization in Korea. So Kubota proposed a project to this business magnate from his prefecture, a guy named Noguchi Jun, who was president of Chisso, then a rising electrochemical conglomerate based in Minamata, where they had a large factory and a small dam. Noguchi invested in Kubota's idea, which would provide cheap electricity for the production of chemical fertilizers, plastics, and other materials that were seeping into the environments of Imperial Japan. And I just thought this image was kind of neat, right? This is from Chisso, right? This just shows all the different nitrogen products that Chisso here makes, and that's seeping into the environments of modern Japanese society. Now, this was the origin of the massive Hongnam chemical complex in northeastern Korea, which became the world's third largest chemical complex. Kubota built dams in northern Korea for Chiso, I showed you a little map there, and worked out his notion of comprehensively developing the environment for heavy industrial chemical development throughout Japan's empire. In the 1950s, after the war, Chiso rebuilt its factories in Japan based on the expertise that engineers had developed in colonial Korea. One practice, dumping mercury waste into waterways, was first practiced here at Hungnam, creating a phenomenon researchers have dubbed recently Hungnam disease, which was Minamata disease's precursor. Fast forward to 1961, summer of 1961, just as the Minamata disease was first identified and Japan had embarked on its economic miracle, Japan's foreign ministry suddenly received a telegram from South Korea's KCIA inviting Kubota and several other former Chiso engineers by name to conduct a hydropower study. This was only a few months after the former Manchukuo Imperial Army officer Park Chung-hee seized power in Korea. Kubota sent 5 experienced engineers from his engineer consultancy, a company called Nippon Koei, where many former Chiso engineers with experience in colonial Korea had worked, and they sent them on a top secret tour of South Korea's hydropower sites, some of which were already half constructed by many of these same engineers during the colonial era. Immediately afterwards, and 4 years before Japan and South Korea normalized diplomatic relations, Nippon Koei was awarded with engineering contracts to supervise the construction of dams for Park Chung-hee's first 5-year economic plan to rapidly industrialize Korea. Nippon Koei and many other Japanese companies benefited greatly through these dam building contracts and river basin studies to power South Korea's massive industrial base projects and simplify Korea's landscapes for industrial growth. As the Minamata struggle gained in strength, many of Japan's own pollution-producing industrial companies also shifted to Korea to escape environmental regulation. And so once again, Japan played a major role in engineering Korea's landscapes, this time in the name of South Korean modernization and heavy industrial economic growth, which left its own environmental legacies. The engineering of new heavy chemical products that would enter into the bodies of Koreans and Japanese relied on the massive engineering and simplification of environmental landscapes to provide the huge amounts of energy required for heavy chemical processes and the water for mass urbanization, mass agriculture, and industrial growth. Now, Kubota was at the front lines of comprehensively engineering colonial landscapes in partnership with government engineers, and his activities thrived after the war as Japan extended its now development empire, Aid Empire, across post-colonial Asia. And this is from its PR lead, the literature of the company. You can see where Nippon Koei is active in all the US Cold War hotspots, right? South Vietnam, South Korea, of course, Indonesia, even Taiwan, they built a project. Places that the US really couldn't go, like, or where there are neutral countries, like Burma. So, it kind of maps on also to the former places where the Japanese occupied fairly well. And so that's what I'm doing in my current book. I mean, today I'm presenting on one chapter on Korea, but I do work on Vietnam, projects in Vietnam and Burma, or now Myanmar, and Laos. So in today's talk, through the example of a post-war Japanese aid project in South Korea called Soyangang Dam, I'm going to argue that examining Japan's colonial legacies and transnational relationships is an essential part of doing Japanese environmental humanities. Japan's domestic history of environmental destruction extended its tentacles across Japan's empire, as well as after the war in the post-colonial landscapes of Asian nations. Now, this approach necessitates multilingual research and analyzing the context beyond Japan outside the purview of traditional Japanese studies, or Japan studies. To organize my talk, I'm going to focus on a few scales of the dam through which histories of Japanese colonialism intersected with post-independent South Korean efforts at national land planning. So 3 scales. 1, the scale of planning. 2, the scale of subjectivity. And 3, the scale of the environment and the people. And so by breaking down dam construction by scale, you begin to see, or one begins to see dams and environments less as these durable fixed objects, but more as these complex dynamic assemblages of political, economic, technological, financial, ecological, and cultural networks over space and time. And one can also see the specific power mechanisms and the various contingencies that inevitably permeate the transformation of the environment or the transformation of landscapes. Now, in proposing dam projects, Japanese development consultants like Kubota use the term Sougo Kaihatsu, right? Comprehensive development, a concept with very strong links to the colonial era. So comprehensive development generally meant transforming a region, usually a river basin, but sometimes often, or like a major city close to natural resource zones, transforming this region into this efficient, optimal system whereby each part somehow contributed to the other parts of the whole in mutually reinforcing ways. So for example, building a dam not just for one purpose, such as power production, but for multiple interrelated purposes like regional industrial development, flood control, mass irrigation, transportation improvement, and so on. So this is an example from one of their projects in South Vietnam, the Da Nang Dam, right? They would build a reservoir here, send the water into generators that would produce electricity to send to Saigon, but also a nearby industrial zone in Cam Ranh Bay, but also to irrigate this plain right here, to improve transportation along here, right? Looking at the environment as this engineered, comprehensive organic system was the overall philosophy. But for the Japanese, it was geared more towards heavy industry. Now, such paradigms first took shape in the context of Japanese colonial expansion on the Asian continent. So in Manchukuo, Korea, North China, projects usually centered on big dams emphasized the promotion of heavy and military-related chemical industries oriented around resource extraction, but also addressing some issues of flood control, irrigation, water supply, and urban and rural development. Kubota helped elaborate this comprehensive development through constructing dams in colonial Korea for Chisso and conducting comprehensive surveys for hydropower and industrial development in China, Hainan Islands, Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies, both for Chisso and the Japanese military. Comprehensive development projects were a key pillar of Japan's pan-Asianist ideologies of constructing East Asia, liberating the continent from Western imperialism, and ushering in an era of Asian co-prosperity. And so Japan's massive engineering of its empire formed the basis to Nippon Koei's development philosophy in the post-war, which it then marketed to decolonizing nations in Asia, like South Korea, with the support of the Japanese government and business community. So this is from a PR brochure in 1970, right? And they're advertising what they did in colonial Korea. It says North Korea presently. This is the network that they built. These are the dams that they built. This was the second largest dam in the world in the 1940s after Grand Coulee Dam. And their marketing brochures would go to Southeast Asian governments and other post-colonial nations as well. Just to give you an idea of what Sougo Kaihatsu, or comprehensive development, is, this is what the Japanese did during the colonial era in Manchuria, right? They divided Manchuria into 3 industrial zones, usually centered around a huge dam. So Sukbong Dam for southern Manchukuo, Fengman Dam for central, Jingbo Lake for northern, and then these would be geared towards resources, industrial bases, and also ports that would send a lot of the materials throughout the Japanese empire. Now, back to the story. The Soyangang multi-purpose dam project was built between 1967 and 1973 in the mountainous province of Gangwon-do for development of the Seoul Incheon industrial region. Soyanggang's construction was made possible by grants and loans from the normalization treaty between Japan and South Korea and the Claims Fund, which settled all claims against Japan from the colonial era under the rubric of economic cooperation. Soyangang Dam was one of several large-scale infrastructure projects initiated by the Park Chung-hee regime in the 1960s that were symbols of South Korea's Miracle of the Han economic takeoff. So let me start the scale of planning, okay? On this late afternoon, I'm not going to bore everyone with the details of Korea's bureaucratic struggles and engineering design details and negotiations, but suffice it to say, Japanese notions of heavy industrial comprehensive development, while attractive to POC's technocrats, also faced a lot of resistance from American-influenced technocrats dedicated to more balanced, gradualist development. So just to give you an idea, this is the idea of balanced development, right? Doing all these different purposes from agriculture to flood control to industrial development and urban development to a more of a Japanese emphasis on industrial bases, chemical industrial bases on the coast. Right? I mean, if you go to Japan, right, you look at the Pacific coast, it's this big mess of chemical, huge conglomerates. And so that was the basis which we also sold to the Korea, right? These coastal export zones, but also very much geared towards heavy chemical industries, which dams would be at the center of. So, moreover, just to add a third curveball into the picture, Park Chung-hee himself faced a predominantly rural population and a national security threat from North Korea, causing him to focus largely on agricultural issues, but also thinking about building military-related heavy industries. And so my point is, all these agendas clashed at the level of planning, at the scale of planning, and also in the very design. How do you come up with the design of Soyeongang Dam? Do you build a high dam? Do you build a low dam? And also in the implementation itself. And so my overall point is that at the scale of the level of planning of the dam itself, and also of the environment, it's not this progressive march of state-led high modernist development, right? It's not just you have an idea and you implement it, but it's constantly, incessantly unstable. It's this contingent process of competing planning and engineering agendas through and through, right? You have bureaucrats with the different agendas. You have investigative teams wrestling with the environment. You have provincial officials. You have national security issues. I mean, just all constantly, this is a messy process, right? And so seemingly coherent processes of engineering and state planning are always formed in this midst of conflict, uncertainty, and shifting circumstance, which is often a point that's missed in predominant narratives of modernization and development. So this is a key idea of state power. State power is not this monolithic thing, right? It's very complicated, and different actors also negotiate with different actors as well. And so this contingency struggle, negotiation, applies to the other two scales I'll talk about next. While this technocratic scale of planning was important in shaping landscapes, at the same time we should also pay attention to immaterial scales of subjectivity. And so that is both the politics of constituting the developmental subject through these kind of big projects and planning, and also the politics of subjectivity among the experts themselves. This politics of subjectivity shaped the nature of projects like Soyeongang Dam, right? There's a lot of work in environmental humanities about, the kind of subject needed to create an ideology of controlling nature, right? So the liberal subject vis-a-vis nature, right? And so that's why I'm also emphasizing subjectivity. So just to back up a little bit, my research into the world of envirotechnology began after graduate school. So I was a graduate student in intellectual history. I studied the complicated meanings of technology, gijutsu. But in Japan, gijutsu meant more than objective instrumental stuff, means, right? It was fundamentally tied to issues of subjectivity, praxis, right? Technology as techne. And my question back then was, as Japan rapidly modernized, how did technology change the very fiber of Japanese society and even subjectivity? So for example, the Kyoto School philosophers said this, right? Technology is the act of making things. The common essence of technology is to make things, whatever they may be, whether they're tools, machines, mental and bodily forms, social systems, or ideas. And so all these other thinkers talked about technology in the Japanese spirit, the possibilities for aesthetic meaning, social organization, even as a basis for organizing the Japanese empire. After graduate school, I looked at how these concepts of technology played outside the walls of these intellectuals, the worlds of state policy, science and engineering, even filmmaking. And so engineering proved to be a very compelling arena for me to understanding these dynamics of Gijutsu, of technology, because engineering projects were filled with utopian imaginations and ideas of unalienated subjectivity. But it had a material aspect, which I also wanted to wrestle with. So my first book, Constructing East Asia, I analyzed this technological imaginary that was this ideology of mobilizing Japan's empire, but that was partly conducted through massive engineering, through these huge engineering projects that would supposedly liberate Asia from exploitative Western imperialism. So back to the story. Former Japanese colonial engineers who came to Korea as consultants in the 60s similarly presented themselves as these global cosmopolitan consultants who strove to understand the actual conditions of Asia's developing countries, in contrast to these so-called arrogant, uninformed Western consultants. And so in many ways, these Japanese consultants were only adapting their earlier Pan-Asianist discourse towards Asia. And I just pulled out this interesting song that was composed by Japanese engineers in Vietnam. I won't sing it, don't worry. Look at the language, right? We're one with you, our hopes are the same with you. We're bringing you this advanced technology. Look at the term that they use for Southeast Asia, Nampo, right? I mean, this is the colonial term. So you can see it's infused with, this Pan-Asianist meaning, and also this kind of Japan as the universal subject, bringing you our people, being one with you, and bringing us the technology, right? Okay, so when Japanese engineers first visited South Korea, they described an atmosphere at construction sites that resembled Japan's wartime era. They admired the workers' militarized discipline, which they saw as motivated by a strong desire for national independence. So in response, they even developed this concept of the honorable Nipponkoe man, right? Or the developmental warrior who would fight alongside their Korean counterparts and help industrialize Korea while humbly not taking credit for their own work. At the same time, though, they were critical of this type of militarized development. Just to give you an example, in 1963, one Nipponkoe engineer recalled armies of the National Construction Service at a Chuncheon Dam, working night and day in freezing temperatures. This Japanese engineer admired the tough Korean spirit, but he knew from his earlier experience in colonial Korea that this emphasis on speed without consideration for winter temperatures would just lead to leaks in the dam structure when they filled the reservoir. But he didn't criticize them because he respected Korean nationalism. He was very sensitive to Korean nationalism. But sure enough, in the spring of '64, 500 leaks were discovered after the dam was filled, prompting newspapers to saying that, it's going to collapse, and managers were panicking because they're going to be punished by the military. Nipponkoe's vice president, Sato Tokiko, an engineer with a 20-year career in colonial Korea, was flown in for an emergency inspection, and again, taking up this global universal position, he said, citing his experience in colonial Korea, building dams under similar extreme conditions, Sato reported that, there's going to be some power loss, and it won't be the fanciest dam, but, there's no danger, and you can fix the major leaks. But then he went on to criticize the military culture of fear, and he told Korea Power's president that, mistakes are the norm in civil engineering, and it was the only way you guys can advance technologically. And so in this manner, Nipponkoe engineers sublimated or translated their experiences at Korean projects into their own recent colonial experiences of working under wartime mobilization and painstakingly learning Western technology. Different from Western consultants, they said, Japanese engineers invoked this common experience of late development to try to create these subjective bonds with their modernizing Korean counterparts. And I put this quote from a Japanese reporter, and again, it reflects like what the Japanese want to hear, right? This Korean industrial telling them that, we don't want food, we want dams, right? We want to really develop our country, right? So again, universe particular dynamics are working like that. So these bonds, though, these subjective bonds were more than subjective because they were grounded in a longer institutional history that reached into colonial times. The National Construction Service, or the National Land Construction Corps, that engineers admired, Japanese engineers admired, was established in 1962. This was a semi-forced, or even forced at times, labor unit that worked on large-scale infrastructure projects like dams, roads, land reclamation projects. In many ways, Park Chung-hee unproblematically continued many of the same pressured forced labor practices from the Japanese colonial era. He launched this construction service as part of his 5-year economic plan and made it into a campaign of social reform, so criminals, misfits, juvenile delinquents, through labor. Units were sent, these construction corps were sent to construct Soyangang Dam. And so this subjective bond forged between Japanese engineers and their Korean counterparts at militarized construction sites was more than imaginary. It had a foundation in a shared colonial past where state-led development, mass mobilization, arbitrary state power to shape landscapes were the norm. And in the Japanese engineers' mind, this is a necessary stage for late developers like Japan and South Korea. And I put this picture from colonial times to kind of give you the sense that this is what Japanese engineers dealt with. They dealt with mass labor, forced labor, semi-forced labor at their site. So this was a very familiar site. They didn't talk directly about that, but I mean, they were very familiar of what they were seeing in South Korea. Ultimately, though, this type of military, they would distance themselves from this. This type of militarized development was just a stage for these Japanese engineers. This wasn't the end point of development. But Park Chung-hee had a different notion of development that included developing the post-colonial citizen or subject of the now divided Korean nation through spiritual mobilization campaigns like this construction service. So for example, all Koreans knew the slogan, "Let's construct while fighting," right? This is banners everywhere, right? Meaning that Koreans should mobilize to develop their nation while remaining vigilant against North Korea. Or they're forced to do military training at their workplace through units of the Homeland Reserve Army. And so these displays, you know, they're very nostalgic for these Japanese engineers, but ultimately they're a source of curiosity, bewilderment, since Japanese experts separated objective development goals from subjective outcomes. Unlike Park Chung-hee, who saw subjective and objective economic development as inseparable. Now, the subjective outcome for Japanese experts was this, like I put here, post-war consumerist, hardworking subject of high-speed economic growth. One Japanese engineering report submitted to the Korean government even provided the example of a certain Mr. Yamada and his family, a representative Japanese household that was pulling itself out of poverty after the war. So Mr. Yamada's story was the perfect example of modernization theory. Mr. Yamada was the second son of a poor farming family in Himeji who benefited from US occupation land reforms. So based on this foundation, he then worked as a bulldozer operator at Fuji Steel on Japan's increasingly industrialized coast. His wife farmed as well as took care of the household, earning extra money as a midwife. And so through savings, hard work, and technical ingenuity, their family expanded their house and bought more land through cooperative loans. But even though Mr. Yamada achieved a certain economic self-sufficiency, he still felt sorry for his wife because he wanted to buy all these appliances, labor-saving appliances for his wife, right? Very gendered idea of development going on here. So dam construction, the report argued, helped develop coastal industrial zones, which provided employment for rural residents like Mr. Yamada with work, right? Cheap chemical fertilizers for his farm, advanced machinery, and advanced electric appliances that would help them save on their labor. And so Nippon Koei's report to Korea not only highlighted hydropower's contribution to Japan, but through Mr. Yamada's example, made an argument about how increased investment in power infrastructure was an essential part of lifting nations out of poverty by promoting this kind of self-sufficiency. A message that really, resonated with Korea's government. So in Nippon Koei's report, it shows us the developmental subject, right? That Japan was promoting, this skilled, hardworking, consumerist subject of post-war Japan. It included some of these militarized tropes of Japanese subjectivity that they recognized in Park Chung-hee's campaigns, but ultimately, Japanese engineers viewed these incessant campaigns of Park Chung-hee to shape the post-colonial subject through these mobilizations as insufficiently modern, as irrational, and obstructed to the more important task of objectively developing Korea for industrial modernization. Let me get to my final point, or the final scale that was erased, right? The scale of the local region, the living environment of Gangwon-do. Now, the rest of my talk is going to focus on Korea more than Japan, but it's essential to understand the historical specificities of Korea, since we also learn about Japan's colonial legacies and its continued influence on Asian landscapes. So first, as is well documented in the Japanese literature, the spread of Japan's infrastructure development aid complex is tied to the emergence of Japan's construction state, so Dokenkokka, right? This alliance of construction companies, LDP politicians, bureaucrats, who all of these networks extended well into the colonial period. As Japan aggressively marketed its big infrastructure projects in Korea and elsewhere, this construction state was ensuring that almost every inch of Japan landscape coasts were plastered with concrete. Comprehensive development of landscapes as a means of exerting power over regions went hand in hand with promoting similar initiatives abroad. This leads me to my second reason for talking about Korea today. Japan's active promotion of what's called developmentalism to post-colonial nations like South Korea. Developmentalism, state-managed capitalist economic growth in which large-scale infrastructure was essential. Developmentalism, of course, had colonial roots in Manchukuo and Korea and was attractive to post-colonial Asian nations in the wake of Japan's economic miracle of the 60s. And the environmental effects of developmentalism have been devastating. Third, talking about Korean dynamics demonstrates the importance of the post-colonial as this analytical framework for Japan and East Asian studies, as Japan continues to deny its colonial wartime legacies, and also as struggles to decolonize all aspects of society continue in South Korea and elsewhere. It's essential, I think, to step a little bit outside of our nation-state boundaries, in my case, to understand the colonial underpinnings of Sogo Kayat's right comprehensive development and its continuing legacies for the environment, which don't neatly map into nation-states, right? So, to the story, right? Against Park Chung-hee's powerful ideology of sacrifice, the voices of more than 18,000 people were lost, of national economic development, as were the specific histories and cultures of this nearly 13-mile region in Gangwon-do. I think I showed you a map. Okay, there's a map. Gangwon-do. So the dam was built. This is Seoul, right? There's Chuncheon. So the dam is near Chuncheon. That should give you a rough idea of where it is. So Soyeongam and other Gangwon-do dams enabled the Seoul Incheon capital and industrial region to rapidly develop at the expense of the rural regions, right? So you might know Gangnam, right? Gangnam would be a flood mess without Gangwon-do's dam. So Gangnam is the priciest real estate in Korea, but without Gangwon-do's dams, Gangnam would not be almost possible, right? And so at the level of Soyeongam's dams affected residents, the nation took precedence over their livelihoods. Now, the scale of the affected residents acquires another dimension when we look at the longer history of Gangwon-do from the Japanese colonial era. In the 1960s, Gangwon-do had Korea's largest concentration of slash-and-burn farmers, or hwajanmin, in Japanese kadenmin, due to its mountainous and remote geography. So this hwajanmin phenomena, which also existed in Japan at one point, dates from the Chosun era. But their numbers increased during Japan's colonial rule when the government general conducted a comprehensive land survey whereby many residents lost their titles or they didn't have cleared and they were displaced. And so these lands became state-owned lands or forests, and they were sold off to zaibatsu or rich farmers, Japanese farmers. Displaced farmers fled to the mountains and then practiced Huajianmin agriculture, which the government general both cracked down on, but also sometimes encouraged because this is a cheap way to clear lands for development. And so, moreover, similar to Japan, Huajianmin became further stigmatized as the cause of deforestation, very serious deforestation, which both deflected attention from Japan's actions, its lumber interests, and allowed the colonial state to further regulate rural life. And so this increasing criminalization of Huajianmin also created a larger pool of colonial labor that then went to Japan to work in Japan's polluting factories and coal mines in the 1910s and 1920s. Upon liberation, Huajianmin numbers increased in the south due to Koreans returning from Japan's former empire and the devastating Korean War. From the late 1960s, when Gangwon-do's dams were built, Park Chung-hee banned Huajianmin agriculture and forcibly resettled them. He justified this by asserting that Huajianmin were national security risks, and they were the source of deforestation problems that still plagued South Korea, and also land exhaustion. Problems which actually had a lot of their origins in Japanese colonization. And so similar to the colonial era, Park brought this entire apparatus of classification, mobilization, management, police power upon a historically stigmatized Gangwon-do Huajianmin, some of whom actually probably migrated from the north in colonial times. See, I'm getting ahead of myself. Former residents provide us, I must have skipped, okay. So former residents provide us a glimpse of the society that was lost and disrupted by the dam's construction. So Naepyeong-ri, which is a submerged village, was a mountain trade center for the region where Huajianmin itinerant farmers, charcoal makers, wood gatherers, rafters, small traders from the mountain areas would gather to buy and sell goods and services. And so the dam disrupted this very fluid regional economy by dividing and submerging administrative units and replacing submerged roads with routes that tied the region to Seoul and to Chuncheon. The dam split up Buksangnam Township, which was a center, but this became a periphery in Gangwon-do as a result of the reservoir. And so the remaining residents had to navigate a new geography to new centers by means of boats, by means of roundabout roads, and faced with this powerful discourse of national sacrifice, as well as these eminent domain laws that had their origins in colonial times, even those who wanted to openly protest could not, and so most just took the compensation amounts that were very low, they moved into the mountains, or they moved to the regional cities where they led precarious lives, often tales of loss, depression, alcoholism, victimization by speculators characterized the testimonies of these former residents that could never really adjust to the new environments. So their story again invoked memories of what happened in other comprehensive development projects during colonial times, but also what was happening contemporaneously in post-war Japan's construction state. All resistance was restricted to compensation issues, right? So, and these played out in local compensation committees that were filled with local notables, like police officials and also bureaucrats. This was again pioneered in colonial times. South Korea's Minister of Construction, in fact, was a local notable in Hamhung province during the colonial era who helped persuade Korean landlords to sell their lands to Chiso. Affected residents planted trees to increase their compensation amounts. They asserted property rights over gray zones. Residents downriver filed petition protesting the lower water wells levels. Nearby farmers argued that lower water temperatures from the dam lowered their rice harvests. Desperate farmers wrote these old-style calligraphic petitions to Park Chung-hee, take care of your suffering subjects, to the Minister of Construction. This is one of the more interesting ones. This is complaining about psychological damage to their chickens who stopped laying eggs due to the construction noise from the project. Rumors are another tactic, right? For example, these poisonous Salmosa snakes appeared at the construction site as a result of all the earth excavation. And so one newspaper described the dam as this viper's nest, right? Snakes were oozing out of the wall. It was gonna be destroyed by these snakes, right? And so facing this resistance, Korean technocrats became really frustrated with what they described these narrow-minded residents who did not support nation building. And so when they faced this so-called irrational resistance, Korean engineers displayed the same paradigms of industrial progress as their Japanese consultant counterparts. In fact, you can hardly ignore the echoes of the colonial past at Soyeongang. You know, things like promoting dams for national industrialization to rapidly catch up with the West, destroying communities in the name of progress, redeploying colonial forms of state power like eminent domain laws and local compensation committees, and of course labor court, right? And so thus, whereas Park Chung-hee pursued infrastructure project construction in the name of economic independence, he was also reintroducing familiar discourses and institutions of colonial power at the expense of Gangwon-do's residents. Now, the altered environment around Soyeongang was more difficult to suppress, as was the case in earlier Japanese dam projects in colonial Korea. Because Japanese and Korean engineers could not predict the effects on farming, fishing, flood control in their designs. And these environmental issues demonstrate how dynamic environments always exceed paradigms of Sogo Kayatsu, right, comprehensive development. So building on colonial era data, Japanese and Korean engineers produced all these detailed charts, maximum, minimum stream flow, water volumes, precipitation, that enabled them to calculate the exact monetary value of the dam's benefits to industry, irrigation, land reclamation. Damming the Soyeongang River and transforming it into this enormous lake, however, drastically affected water circulation. And so water temperatures fell, causing major damage to crops from cold water and irrigation. And so they had to build an extra warm water, little reservoir to warm the water for irrigation to address that issue. Moreover, the 45 square mile reservoir created a huge lake that trapped the heat that came from the sunlight. The differences between the water temperature and the cooler air increased the number of fog and frost days, which also had a negative effect on farming. And so despite all these confident claims by Japanese engineers saying, you know, we have lots of experience, that their dam design would comprehensively manage nature for high-speed economic growth, also the Korean government's enthusiasm, clearly their designs still privileged the center over the periphery. Japanese consultants and technocrats also promised the development of a fish farming industry, and controlled fish releases would happen to alleviate the damages to fish ecology. But you know, during the colonial era, Japanese colonial engineers also made similar promises about promoting fish industry, and this became a kind of normalized solution. But the dam created a deep lake with no shallow coastal zones for fish, and water levels would change over 30 meters because of releases and non-releases, right? And so this fluctuation killed the lake's aquatic plants, which deprived fish habitats, and now there's only 50 fish species when you had much more diversity. So environmental regulation then in turn came in, but this then destroyed the fish processing industry because of permit costs. And so once again, comprehensive development models were inadequate and privileging statistic-based visions of national growth over Gangwon-do livelihoods and the specific ecologies. The most serious issues came from global climate change. Despite decades of studies dating from the colonial era and confident assertions by Japanese consultants regarding their knowledge, Soyeongang's gates had to be opened to alleviate dangerously high water levels, and this is shown in the picture, right? Typhoons in '84 and 1990 created dangerously high water levels that threatened to overtop the dam and caused serious flooding to Seoul. In 2004, so they had to build 4 additional spillways to alleviate the excess water. Now, to open a dam's gates, you have to plan it carefully, because if you open all of a sudden, you know, a massive flood, right? And so Soyeongang is also made of sand and gravel. So if a dam overtops a soil and gravel, it can cause structural damage, whereas a concrete dam, you don't have that worry. So that's another thing that they have to worry about. While it's unfair to fault Japanese engineers for not predicting climate change. At the same time, comprehensive development models needed to consider flood control and disaster prevention more than the concerns of industry and mass irrigation. And additionally, this was not the first time that Japanese dam designs failed to predict the behavior of Korean rivers. You also saw this in the colonial period, where they faced similar issues of flood and drought. So just to conclude, because I think my time's up, in the 60s, at the height of Japan's economic miracle and the Minamata movement, this engineer named Honma Norio, he was a longtime engineer in Korea in the colonial times and post-war consultant, lamented that Japanese were getting worked up about pollution when evidence showed that income equality and life expectancy were increasing due to Japan's rapid economic growth. Now, this comment not only revealed a gross insensitivity to the Minamata victims and a lack of awareness of Japan's ongoing environmental crisis, but I think gets at the heart of the modernization and development ideology behind the Minamata disaster and Japanese industrial modernity. And this is an ideology that writers like Ishimura Michiko, Ogata Masato addressed in trying to go beyond the level of just monetary compensation. And so today I just focused on one manifestation of this civilizational ideology, the drastic engineering of environments, which in Japan's case took the form of Sogo Kaiatsu, right? Comprehensive development, which is a project that emerged through Japanese colonization. This civilizational ideology of industrial modernity was expressed in 1924 when Kubota gazed over North Korea's lived environments and saw them as barren wastelands for industrial development. This logic was expressed in the simplified waterways that became the energy arteries for Chiso's massive growth. It was expressed in the pain-racked bodies of Hongnam and Minamata disease patients who were the victims of Chiso's colonial developed expertise. It was expressed in the destroyed livelihoods and communities in colonial Korea, post-war Japan, post-colonial landscapes across Asia, where Japan extended its development empire, chapters I'm also working on in Vietnam, Burma, and Laos. Environmental issues know no boundaries, and Japanese environments are no exception. They are the product of conscious and unconscious dynamics developed in a long history of colonial expansion that went hand in hand with the comprehensive engineering and in many cases destruction of Japanese landscapes, communities, and bodies. Thank you.
So I think we're going to have to take your own questions, if you don't mind. And again, our session is until 5. And I know that there was a little bit of energy and questions. So, close the door. Sure.
I very much enjoyed that talk. I love the way you put post-war, wartime, colonial and war and post-war Japan and Korea in dialogue with each other. And I just have a very simple-minded question. You used a phrase I didn't really quite understand what you were trying to say, and that's simplify the environment.
Yeah.
What exactly do you mean by that, and why is it necessary?
Okay, so Japan's early environment, I mean, this is all about the Green Archipelago, right? Okay, it was partly engineered, but the Japanese waterways were geared more towards, letting rivers flood and take their natural course, using the natural energies of rivers for agriculture and things. But then they switched to a philosophy of controlling serious Japanese floods that occurred in the early Meiji era, late Meiji era, to direct waters to separate the lands from the rivers, right? And so you need to straighten the courses and get the water quickly out to the ocean, right? Also, as dam development began, you would get the water to go certain speeds into dams, right? So you have to straighten dams. I mean, if you go to Japan today, concrete walls, flood control, it's all about separating the rivers, which then means also simplifying the courses from the environment, right? So massively engineering them, and also joining rivers together. That's another thing, right? So dams don't just use the different streams and they put rivers together. They combine rivers into one. They divert their flows, leading some rivers to be dry and things like that. So that's a very simple answer to it. So simplifying the courses. Yeah, I mean, that played, just to give you an example, the Fukushima disaster was enabled by the simplification, not enabled, I mean made worse by this history of simplifying the environment because the floodwaters and tsunami even went inside, right, and they caused extensive damage. So that's, I mean, the simple answer, I guess, to the question.
Well, just to follow up on that, so you were saying because the way the dam was built, the water level basically went straight on down, so there weren't things for the whole aquatic, sort of with plant life and for the various different strata of fish species. Was there anybody at the time, writing their boss saying, we really need to think about this, or did they?
Korea? I mean, because in the 60s, in Korea, it was really about, we gotta build this infrastructure I mean, there was some effort at, greenification, right? But ecology, I mean, it was limited to Park Chung-hee's wife releasing carp into the Soyoga River, right, as, we care about nature. But I don't think, I mean, I couldn't detect any kind of in Korea, so, and if there was, I don't think they would really. They can just say, oh, we'll release more fish, we'll develop a fish industry. We'll alleviate it somehow, right? We'll do fish releases, engineering will solve the issue.
I'm not sure, this is a little bit later period, that you did mention that Fall River Basin development, which is a huge controversy, and as a layperson, I do not know which one to listen to. So what's going on there?
Now, the Fall River, I believe it's still going. I mean, I did some research at the Korea Water Resources Corporation, and they have whole sections on this Fall River.
I mean, it is. I mean, the debate has to do with something like that kind of engineering damage, Nile River, just like that, right?
So now, what's grown in Korea is a regional, you would say, anti-dam movement. So in terms so in Gangwon-do, you go there, there's a very strong civil society that we've sacrificed for Seoul. Now it's time for Seoul to invest in Gangwon-do. And look at the damages that you've caused to Gangwon-do. And also attention to small energy, green. So I mean, environmentalist movement in Korea is really taking off. And also, like you said, this flood basin, there's a lot of really protest against this flood basin. So now you're beginning to get these local initiatives at the provincial level to finally, assert the interests of the mountainous rural regions against the center. That would be a kind of, I mean, I'm not super deep into these new movements, but I'm noticing that as well. And a lot of the material that I got today is also a product of what they uncovered through research and things like that. And also what I found in the Korea Water Corporation's archives in Daejeon as well. So, I guess, President Andy.
So I thought your talk was just so beautifully crafted. I love the narrative, and I was completely convinced by your argument that we cannot, the Japanese environmental humanities, quad Japanese doesn't really make sense. So I have a million questions, but let me start with this anecdote that you gave about being in grad school and really identifying yourself as an intellectual historian, but finding that you really wanted to understand technology. And you were going to, at the same, that would fit within the rubric of intellectual history. I wanted to ask you more about, tell more of that story, because I really like that story. But I was in, you mentioned the Kyoto School in that part of your narrative, and we had this workshop with grad students in Tom Lamar in December recently, and he was talking about how interesting the Kyoto School is for environmental humanities and all of the really ambitious things that they were trying to think. So I was wondering if you could say more about that. You talked about, I guess, this break between the way you thought as a grad student and the way you thought afterward when the thing that you were studying kind of forced you to change your way of thinking.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I wouldn't call it break. I would say an expansion of the boundaries of what was intellectual history back then, away from just discourse analysis, textual analysis, into, you know, intellectual, the stuff you find it's beyond that. It's in policy. It's embedded in material infrastructure. The stuff that the Kyoto School was talking about ideas of subjectivity, not just as internal subjectivity, but as praxis, as creating, you unalienated subjectivity, was in a way, I mean, they weren't necessarily in conversation with each other, but was embodied in all these idealistic projects, you know, by engineers, right? These engineers were very utopian. They couldn't achieve what they could in Japan. You know, they wanted to improve their status in society, and say, look, because of Japan's intrinsic complex civilization, engineers can do more than just be tinkers. We can design and solve all the contradictions of modernity, which include alienated subjectivity, by taking a much more active role in society, by engineering landscapes, by engineering landscapes, by increasing equality and things like that, by then solving a lot of the contradictions through engineering.
But would you say that that this utopia of an unalienated subjectivity, as envisioned by the Kyoto School and by these imperial engineers, although it went off the rails and became completely co-opted by Japanese empire, still has something to offer us as we think about environmental humanities for the future?
Yeah. The way I'm thinking more of a course on environmental thought, and where I see it is, what was great, the Kyoto School's contribution is their idea of bodily subjectivities. Subjectivity is always embodied in the environment, it's not this divorced, you know, I'm subject of here, but always, like that quote I put up, right? It's embedded in creation and making things, and subjectivity always being in shifting in context with the relation of other people. And it's not individual subjectivity, it's always mass subjectivity. It's always, right?
But was I wrong in hearing your story mostly as a very sad story about the
Grad school.
subjectivity? I mean,
No, it wasn't a sad, I saw it as exciting, right? I mean, you can do intellectual history beyond just...
Yeah, but the Earth is getting
The what?
more and more wrecked, the more we...
The what is getting wrecked? Oh, what?
The Earth.
Oh, this story, I thought you were talking about my...
No, you're fine. No, I thought that was...
It's a sad story, but at the same time, because of Japan's sad story of condensed destruction of the environment, that provides certain lessons for today. Right? I mean, I was just in Japan, and now this thing called dark tourism has been, like, you visit all these sites, but out of that, you know, you learn a lot about, you know, there's like, you know, in contrast to that, now there's been another debate on, you know, how do we, you know, there's an exciting environmental debate on, like, how do we do green growth, right? How do we balance economic development with environmental sustainability, right? I mean, Japan is now post-industrial, aging population. It's struggling for a new economic direction. I mean, of course, there's still the problems of, you know, addiction to fossil fuels and the same old massive engineering, Abe dedicated to that old style. But you do have that other, you know, out of the less, I think you can use it as a teaching moment. And the Japanese themselves are beginning to also address that too.
This is a related question.
Okay.
And thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Also, my question is about technology. So actually, you brought up Kyoto School, Nikki Yoshi's quote, and so that reminds me of actually this very, I wouldn't say obsession, but there are very in Western thought also, right? Technology actually it's a kind of almost defining kind of. It's at the core of human essence, right? Tool making, and human beings as makers of useful things for their communities, and so on, right? And also in many of these modern thinkers, ranging from Hannah Arendt, Heidegger, and the Frankfurt School, all these people, they also share this apprehension and suspicion of technology. So, but not they don't deny. I mean, maybe Adorno is a little bit different, but Arendt and Heidegger, they argue, or they show this kind of dangerous aspects of modern technology by arguing for return to the original sense of technology. The kind of community, or how to relate the subject to the object, surroundings, human beings, surroundings, and so on. So my question, I guess, is there any kind of that kind of suspicion or the apprehension of technology in Japanese thought?
The thinkers that I look at did not have that. It was just there's a suspicion of the idea of instrumental toolmaking, but there was immense exploration of the various possibilities of technology. Right? Well, I've written articles about the possibilities for aesthetics and subjectivity as like projection.
They're more optimistic
So
about
the
technology.
ones of course, there is a whole pessimistic strain, the spiritualist, we have to conquer.
But not the kind of, but I mean, within this critical thinking of technology, is there any?
So suspicion of what kind of Western of
Well, this kind of instrumentality.
Yeah, there's
technology. And I mean, I brought this question up just because you responded to me with a question that these people have a very kind of utopian idea of technology. So it seems like it's all they have.
But it's rooted in a critique of instrumental. Yeah.
Very affirmative, very positive, and so I'm just wondering, is there any kind of thread of some kind of criticism or
The criticism was
suspicions of
that
apprehension of modern technology vis-a-vis technology in the original sense?
So the criticism would be that Japan's industrial modernity created an alienated, and so this, but instead of going the direction of that we should return to, pre-modern. They went the other direction, right? They were like, so, and that ties to a lot of techno-nationalism today and like in the post-war narrative too. Yeah, David had his hand up.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm going to keep myself to 2 questions. I have many. It struck me that at the same time that the Japanese were erecting dams in South Korea across Southeast Asia, the United States is doing something similar with nuclear power plants through the Atoms for Peace initiative. And I'm wondering at a very basic level, if you could expand a little bit further to talk about how your project sheds new light on the nature of the US-Japan alliance in the post-war period, and to what extent that relationship can be understood as one through the lens of technology transfer and this developmental empire that you invoke.
Yeah.
And that's tied to my second question, which is in regards to what I see as one of the most important differences between the colonial period and the post-colonial period, and that is the nature of energy regimes, which is also tied to the growth of nuclear power.
Very much.
So how do shifts towards, let's take South Korea as an example, shifts towards the burning of coal domestically, but also later on the use of nuclear power, how do those shape these sorts of resource politics that you look at?
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, I didn't talk about the U.S. a lot because that would be more complex. And I think there's more. I wanted to, if you talk about the U.S., tends to overshadow the story a lot. And I wanted to bring out the more inter-Asian dynamics here. But to answer your question about the U.S.-Japan alliance, so during the colonial era, Japan was the universal referent, right, in creating the co-prosperity spirit. But with Japan's defeat, now the U.S. becomes the kind of universal, right? They create the U.S. Cold War order, and now Japan is enrolled into the system. And one way by which Japan is enrolled in the system, of course, is not through the military, because they can't, right? But is through development, right? Because they have this vast developmental expertise which especially beginning in the 50s and 60s, especially from 65, when the US began full pressing on the Vietnam War, Japanese engineers were enrolled in many more. They were told to take up the developmental burden in Southeast Asia. By then, the development war between the US and the USSR was in full-fledged, was full-fledged, right? Johnson announced in 65 a TVA for the Mekong Delta, right? And this was began the renaissance of, I mean, you already had Japanese projects, but the Japanese were then really told to, not just the Japanese, but the Koreans, the Taiwanese were then enrolled into this as kind of, I don't know, sub-imperial actors, right? Into this US-Japan alliance. So they're very much enabled by it. They received help from, they received technological help, military help. Projects in Vietnam, it's heavily militarized. I didn't talk about, they would spray insecticide to clear for transmission lines, right? Just heavily, much more, the South and South Korea is, the transformation landscapes in war is Japan is much more heavily involved in Southeast Asia. So Japan is involved in the militarization project of the US-Japan alliance, but through the lens of development. But there's militarized aspects. Korean troops were sent in 65, right? That's 65 is such an important date, right, to Vietnam. And these Korean troops protected Japanese engineers. Like I have an episode where over 100 Korean soldiers died in a firefight with Viet Cong, but they were protecting Japanese engineers, right? So there's a kind of hierarchy, right? The Koreans are sending troops, but they're benefiting from contracts. The Japanese can't send troops, but they're benefiting from a huge contract. So there's a kind of, post-colonial hierarchy at work. The second question, but there's conflicts too though, right? The US is much more emphasizing agriculture at a certain point, Green Revolution, things like that. But Japan is still trying to carve out its own identity. It's not they're listening to the US all the time. They want to increase their own interests, and this is what they do through Sogo Guidance, right, comprehensive development. The second question on energy regimes, so up to 1945, Japanese policy was water first, coal second, or carbon second. Immediately after, it's carbon first, water second. So water becomes much more about the comprehensive uses, well, not just electricity, but dams still remain useful for water provision, right? And those aspects are like irrigation, what else? Flood control and things like that. So they don't totally give it. They shift much more towards emphasizing the various uses of it. And so it's also important for peak load, right? So coal can only meet so much, but in the summer, dams are then put online to meet peak load, right? With nuclear, interestingly enough, a lot of these companies are also interested in the construction of nuclear. That didn't necessarily give up change the rule of dams. 97% of Japan's rivers are dammed. And so, it might be tied to the construction state. Too, a lot of these are boondoggle, why do we even need this dam, right? They do more damage, but still dams retain their meaning, not just for energy issues, I would say, but kind of shifting as the issue.
Thank you for your time. Enjoyed it enormously. Because I invite you to, beyond the context of Japan and Korea, if you could drift a little more philosophically beyond, in your own formation as an intellectual, as a thinker, how useful do you find the word development? And is it commensurable at all with something called environmental dependence? In other words, where is the post in the post-colonial, the post-human, the post-national, back to the earlier questions, thinking, building, dwelling. If you could say more about, is the word development separable at all from colonial legacy? Internal, external. And the other question is, back to inner and the outer, in the case of India, to the Ghar and the Bahar, the real self versus whatever. Any chances of what might the road be that has not been taken? Okay. And if that can even be conceived of in a tone which is non-nostalgic. So all I'm asking is, I'm connecting it with, the philosophical flight to the post-human, the post-national, which seems very ontological, philosophical. out of touch with the political, which requires a certain kind of instrumentality. So I'm just asking you, in your own thinking as an intellectual, where do you position yourself? Where do you think the big issues are?
Today, okay.
Retaining development, do you say good development, bad development?
Yeah.
Ecomimesis, non-ecomic, or do you say junk it all, the whole thing is colonial anyway?
No.
So what we really are talking about is decolonizing being. That is the big question. And the political is only a subset of that. And there are all kinds of slippages in scale,
Yeah.
in even defining goal. That's where the whole thing comes apart. So we really are functioning in a schizophrenic way. The scales don't quite, we're doing this on this level, knowing it's bad, but something is happening over there. So I'm just wondering if you could say, share your own intellectual landscape,
Okay.
how these terms in your own thinking make sense or need to be refashioned. But thank you again.
Okay.
It makes so much
All right,
sense.
thank you very much. So yeah, development, as you point out, is a very abused word, right? Used for more negative, as we know now. It's a whole industry. It's not even national, it's transnational. It's a whole industry, right? Of experts, the UN. I didn't even talk about that level as well, but Japan's very much plugged into that. I would not abandon the word development, though, at all. But unfortunately, it's a level that which even local, what the problem with big development, and it's still big because China is not the biggest possibility with that, is that, let's say you have, like, I don't know, like what's a recent example I've looked at? So let's say you're like this fishing cooperative in Sri Lanka. I worked a little bit in Sri Lanka. So, and all of a sudden the government says, we're going to give you $100 million to build, to modernize your wharf, invest all this, How are they going to say no? Why are you going to say no? Like, oh, that'd be great. But then, of course, it's tied to loans, right? It's tied to the fishing cooperative does not have the capacity to even engage at that level, right? But they can't say no, so what are they going to do? Right? So the key then is then to, and this is what I saw, is to engage the big development discourse into local institutions, develop the capacity that not just about growth, right? Not about GDP, but about empowering the fishing cooperatives to improve local standards of living, to improve relations with the environment, to improve issues of fish depletion, to improve empowerment of women, right? That seems to be, they pay lip service to that, but in the end, the needs of GDPism, the government wants good statistics, right? Even though it hooks them on the loans. But that schizophrenia I see at the level of the local. I don't want to just separate the local from the, because the local does have to, you can't just say no to, 100 million, but it's how do you redirect, maybe you can be, pessimist and say, come on, once you take the money, you sold your soul, right? But I think empowering yourself with expertise, empowering yourself with knowledge of how capital works, how the engineering works, interfering at that level can do, this is already happening in history of science and technology, STS studies, and so the humanities is really beginning to engage in that level. So that's my response right now to that.
So thank you for this amazing talk. There's so much going on, thinking about the relationship between government, and we certainly see a lot of, I'm certain that you could find the same thing in Taiwan. And it's not just water, it's other infrastructure. And if I can kind of bring in David's remarks as well as Raj's. So if we have this idea of development as good or bad, it's post-colonial legacy, it's an extension of colonialism, neo-colonialism. Then how do we look at all of the development projects that you just mentioned that are being put in place by China, right? Because they're going to say, we're not a colonial power. We were once semi-colonialized, right? So I'm wondering if there's two different sorts of ideologies or discourses of infrastructure development, but that's obviously not part of the project here. But it strikes me as something that if we really want to look at all of Asia, we need to, or at least East Asia and Southeast Asia, is think about what is left over of an extension of the Japanese empire, and how does that differ, or does it differ from what's coming out of contemporary China. But I guess my more practical and down-to-earth question is, are you seeing with this notion of green development or sustainable development, are you seeing the old networks, the old colonial and post-colonial networks, are you seeing, for example, windmill farms being built by, is there some way to trace this back to the old Japanese empire as well?
There is a lot more research. I've seen research about the origins of environmentalism at, in the early 20th century. And I don't do it myself, but I mean, there was, in Japan itself, there's a debate between this kind of Sogo Kayatsukai and people more interested in balanced regional development. So I didn't even talk about that. I mean,
Okay, I think maybe my question wasn't clear enough. What I'm asking is, you demonstrated how the hydropower engineering in the Korean Peninsula, a lot of it was, kind of, we'll invite the colonials back, but we won't call them a colonial power anymore. We'll say they're international development agencies, right? Are we, or is there some sort of engineering connection or development still going on? What I mean is like, okay, so the hydroelectric dams, they were all built by these engineers who, got their engineering chops as colonizers when they came back. Is there some sort of connection between, I forget, like Koei or these other large corporations? Are they also involved in building wind farms or something like that?
The whole development complex now has to engage in environmental issues. It's like Japan signed up to the development, I guess we call it guidelines, and so it's all about, and it's big business too, right? And that's its own problem, right? Green diplomacy, and oftentimes it's just more engineering.
So is it just an extension?
Well, not extension, but it's,
I mean,
you're adding an extra layer to stuff. You're adding an extra layer of engineering to something that might be addressed much more simply, and loading, creating more issues of debt and other corruption, things like that. But yeah, I mean, environmental issues are definitely part of, like, I had an affiliation with JICA, and they always have to, now you have to do environmental sustainability studies. I mean, the 70s was also the height of the anti-dam movement. Japan couldn't totally ignore that. I maybe ignore that. And so sustainability issues like that are just now normalized in the development industry. The Japan-China question is actually interesting because China, we argue a lot with the China people. Say, well, China was never colonized. How do you account for China's behavior because China was never? But I mean, there are connection points, right? I mean, Northeast China. I mean, the first 5-year plan in China was based on stuff that happened in Manchukuo. So I mean, I think, and I'm not an expert on China studies, but I think there's an effort to also try to bring in post-colonial studies into Chinese, and it's controversial because I mean, China people always push back like your project is too Japan-centric. It doesn't. China's different. Right? You don't talk about Chinese development in China, and so it's an ongoing debate. And
I can see how the argument would go that there was China never colonized anybody.
China never colonized, but
well, there was the empire, but that's but also just to David's thing, and you mentioned earlier like sub-colonizers, or
and then what China's doing is at a scale like 10 times bigger than Japan. I mean, it's Japan can never even imagine this level. And of course, there's probably different dynamics at work. You can't just reduce everything to the colony. Even in Japan now, it's just that I mean, yeah, the legacies are still there, but like you said, with the shift towards environmental issues, there was with the Green Revolution a shift towards I mean, I don't want to say that it is exactly the same, but you still have these. I mean, modernization theory is not dead in the third world, right? I mean, you still have this desire for heavy industrialization, right? You see it in the air polluted cities in Asia, right? Like, this is a necessary stage.
And just last to bring up mentioning David in your discussion of atomic energy, actually the fourth atomic power plants in Taiwan is being built by a Japanese company. Right?
Wow.
The first three were General Electric, but then apparently
Okay.
Japan is, I mean, it's a stalled project, but I believe the main contractor is Japanese.
Okay. Oh.
Thank you again.
I was just still thinking, in an earlier conversation, you mentioned these poor villages in Myanmar that are just now finally getting their electricity.
Yeah.
That clearly in part of the world of modernization. So what, you don't, you'll distinguish, separate those.
I wouldn't, it was also a product of insurgency in Myanmar, right? Like, the Karen, where they built the dam was, the Karen were the group that almost actually overthrew the Koreans, so they were really the target of.
Well, I guess what I mean, the modernization with lower Africa.
Oh, okay, fine. No, I mean, they, rural electrification was the agenda from very early. I mean, are you saying that they didn't have any use for?
What I'm saying is that somewhere or another, it didn't seem to happen. As you were saying, is that they had these hydroelectric stuff
Yeah.
from way back,
Yeah.
but it's only now.
That they're, only now, oh, I see. Only now, I mean, they promised it for ages, but they never delivered. And then finally, after they decided to, after campaigns, they decided to actually provide it. And then there's songs from the early democratization movement about transmission lines passing them by. Right, they would over their villages on the way to Yangon, right?
We've got 5 minutes left, and I was wondering if any of the grad students wanted to ask a question. Since we have 2 people working on colonial Korea and Japan. I learned the word Kanenmin from something that Alex was reading. Do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm listening to your project, the kind of windows for me are more through Kyoto Wakka and some literature that I've read on slash and burn farmers, and so a lot of these sort of more developmental sort of technical aspects are not a lot, but that's just not the background I'm coming from. I guess I'm interested in how the kind of personal level of people who are impacted by this type of development might figure into your project, or also, and this is kind of a pot shot, I feel like, but like how does gender bear on this project? You know, like what's the kind of, where does the actual human being figure in here? I know it's an extremely large question, but yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's a question as I presented this material to different audiences, I've always been pushed to, well, what about the local? And I'm probably always going to get the local. But the Koreanness especially was like, well, what's happening? And so finally I'm finding material, I'm getting more into the politics of Common Law and the materials and uncovering petitions and things like that, doing my best to get at that local. I'm going to archives in Vietnam, Myanmar, and with grad assistance and with directed questions to try to get at the level of the actual effects on the people. So I'm not a real Koreanist. I can introduce a lot of that, and I think that it's right. You have to introduce the human element to create a fuller three-dimensional. But I would also push back. I would say, well, at the same time, you can't just romanticize. Well, you've got to understand the dynamics of state power, right? The state is not just, people like to use this term state power or legacies of colonial capitalism, just in shorthand. But how does that work, right? How does capital work? How does state? So I would say that, well, no, I think I do that level in much more detail than, and that's a contribution, I think, to more micro studies of the local. Gender plays a huge role. I just talked about that. big, heavy industrial development is also tied to urban development. It's tied to how labor is organized, right? The men go out to work in the factory, the women go work in the household. So when it then ties into, I only talked about the level of landscape, but then it's tied into, planning cities, planning factories. Then you immediately get into the dynamics of gender. Where are the women working and where are the men? And then, also women working as cheap labor. That would be another aspect. So when it comes to issues of uses of electricity, where the electricity goes, I think that's where more of the gender. And then I guess it comes as a negative example, right? These were totally masculine. There were no women engineers. Right? You saw the language that I used, right? Ipokoi man, right? Men conquering nature, right? Sumo match with nature. They would use, all this kind of language.
Wasn't there a photograph of a woman in one of your slides?
Yeah, but most likely they were the secretary or the typist or something like that. Yeah. But later on in the 80s, that opens some change. And now if you go to, there's more women, still heavily men, at least. But I don't go that far into.
It's a very simple question, two questions. So, is Japan's imagination nature is genderized as woman, like in the West? Woman.
Whoa, what a question.
I'm just.
That's not a simple
What's
question.
the gender of nature in Japan?
Gender.
What is genderless or gender neutral? Mother is not.
I would hesitate to say mother nature. I would think they use, what's the term I translate? There's a more religious, but in terms of the conquering man, that's the thing. But what they're conquering,
Right.
it's again passive. A lot of it is very similar to I guess it's the last. Again, these Japanese engineers are traveling all over the world. They know what's, and they're as conversant in engineering as people in Europe.
Can I ask a question? Just quickly, sorry. Okay. Or should I just?
No.
Okay. So I'm interested in the effects of the dam project, since you talked about the Han, the Gum, the Yongsan, and the Nakdong. So how does that differently? This is kind of a selfish question, but I just read a story about flooding of the Gungang. So how that affects the people in that area of Chungcheong-do. So I guess what I'm asking, because you gave a really specific example of in Gangwon-do, how it affects the fisheries and all of these things. So how does it affect it differently in each province? Does that make sense? My question. So how are the actual
I know people who did this study for actually the Gum region, so hearing what you're saying is actually interesting to me. It depends on the geography. So Gangwon was heavily mountainous.
Yeah.
My sense of Gum is it's a little different.
Yeah.
So the issues would be related to geography and what their its role in the Four River Basin strategically. I'm not super familiar with that. But Gum is one of the major ones. Yongsan is the smallest one. But there's more, the big ones are, Han is the biggest, Gum and Nakdong are all the big ones where dams have developed. And then Yongsan is the smallest. But I would say, it's related to the geography.
Yeah.
As much as I can into
Okay.
right now. But I know Nippoko actually did the comprehensive plan for the Gum region as high by Gum.
Okay.
Well, please join me in thanking.